Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Mal entered into a whirlwind in our last episode when he began a full-time job as road manager. He was so happy to be traveling around with the Beatles, and as he wrote, he felt like a free man. So that got him into trouble with his wife. He was gone for 2 weeks when he first began his job, and he didn't phone or even write his wife, which was terrible. His wife Lily made her dislike known because when he returned home, she left the house with their son for most of the time he was there. That taught him to be more thoughtful, and he started to write to her and phone her when he was gone. He had a horrible time in the beginning of his job, and he felt like he would be fired. He had the most trouble with Ringo's drum kit, and finally, after a while, learned to do it within 2 minutes. He quit his reserves job, and he no longer had the enthusiasm for it. Neil started to handle the Beatles and their business, and Mal handled the equipment and driving the Beatles to where they needed to go. He loved being alone driving. Mal also saw firsthand when Beatlemania started to happen, and it was quite an experience. So let's see what's going on today. After the Beatles Palladium show, Mal left Great Britain for the first time. It was the first time that Mal flew in an airplane, too. George Harrison was a nervous flyer. Mal thought he would be the same way. He was, but there wasn't a problem in the flight. Mal thought he would find free love in Sweden, but he got disappointed. He recalled, "My first taste of foreign parts was a trip to Sweden, and for me a myth was to explode. The much talked about free love one expected in Sweden was impossible to find." The Scandinavian beauties had no time for him. He noticed, though, that the young women began throwing themselves at the Beatles. Free love existed, at least for some parties. By the end of October, Mal and the Beatles returned to the United Kingdom, where on November 1st, the band began an autumn tour that would take them through the holidays and to the year's end, as Brian booked them for a series of Christmas shows at the Fionsbury Park, Astoria. The Beatles were working at a fast pace, and they managed to do this by taking Preluden or Prellies, the uppers they had been using since they had been in Hamburg. Mal kept the supplies of them on hand. He got them through the local black market. On November 4th, the Beatles took a break from the tour to play a quartet of songs for the Royal Command performance held at the Prince Wales Theatre. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret were in attendance. John, in an amusing way, said to the regal audience, "For our last number, I'd like to ask for your help. The people in the cheaper seats clap your hands, and the rest of you just rattle your jewelry." Mal remembered the night as excitement running high, and nerves were stretched a little bit that night. John had said during the Beatles rehearsals to ask the audience to rattle your effing jewelry, and that scared Brian. But John, he kept it nice, and he said the line without the cuss word, and Tony Barrow, the publicist, said you could almost hear Brian exhale. I bet. Mal at this time got to meet Marlene Dietrich, the German-born star of film and stage. Mal remembered that she came high-kicking out of her dressing room, and he had a feeling of awe at being in the presence of such a wonderful and well-known personality. She looked fantastic and was bigger than any boy's image could have created over the years, and I can well understand how even British soldiers during the war could fall in love with her. Mal had a pin put in his balloon not long afterwards. Brian confronted him about his conduct. It was during this period Brian took him aside for a little chat. Mal said, to my amazement, he told me, "Mal, I don't like your attitude, and you're looking scruffy." Brian wasn't happy about Mal's fashion choices, to say nothing of his general disposition. In the recent weeks, Mal had started to put his suit away, and he was dressing more casually. He went tieless with a dress shirt and pants, khaki trousers or denim jeans mostly. It was like when his Mal's father told him in the early 1950s that he looked like a lowly Liverpool dock worker. Mal was hurt by Brian's criticism. He felt he was working for very little pay. Mal said, "I guess the attitude that bugged him because it was a permanent smile that he had, and Mal felt that Brian was jealous because I was popular with everybody, enjoying the stresses and strains and doing a good job." Mal wouldn't forget his treatment by Brian. He concluded that Brian should have known better. A few nights later, Brian was in the United States negotiating terms for the Beatles' upcoming American debut, and Mal was put in the position of spokesman. November 7th, the Beatles made their Irish debut, performing a pair of shows at Dublin's Adelphi Cinema. As the first set concluded, The Adelphi had 2,300 people in the audience. They were clamoring for encores, and at the same time several thousand concertgoers were gathering outside for the evening performance. It led to a riot. There were overturned cars, breaking windows, and setting fires. The next morning, as the band prepared to leave Dublin for Belfast, Mal had to face a bunch of journalists. He said, "It was a wonderful reception, but the boys feel bad for the people that got hurt. Although it was a hectic night outside the theater, the boys had a much quieter time, and it was only when they left by the rear van and reached O'Connell Street that they really got a look at what was happening while the show went on." This was our first show in Ireland, and naturally we were a bit worried about what sort of reception we would get. The boys were extremely pleased with that they enjoyed the enthusiasm and all that. With the Beatles' growing popularity, it became harder getting the Beatles from place to place. Mal and Neil came up with a solution for making a fast escape from the rabid fan base. The equipment van was too recognizable, also the tour buses. Working with Liverpool chum Terry Doran, Mal and Neil came up with an exit strategy for the group. They placed a limo near the stage door for a quick getaway. The new NIMS general manager, Alistair Taylor, was on hand where he saw the plan when it was first implemented. Neil pulled up in a black Austin Princess rather than the top-of-the-line limo. The Princess was chosen because it featured doors that opened wide enough to allow the Beatles to dive into the vehicle. Before the concert that night, George Martin arrived with incredible news that the band's latest single, "I'm Gonna Hold Your Hand," was out for 3 weeks and had gotten more than 1 million advance orders. The Beatles whooped with delight. And Alistair Taylor watched the performance they had with Mal from Backstage. As the Beatles finished up their set with Twist and Shout, Mal told Taylor to begin making his way to the limo. Taylor said, "In a minute, Mal, I'm enjoying this." Mal was serious in protecting life and limb of the band and their entourage and whispered something uncomplimentary into Alistair's left ear. He knew he had no choice but to go. Taylor got there just in time, and the Beatles jumped into the limo with the local police as their escort. They got away from the fans in the nick of time. The Beatles not only were in danger with their fans, but by candy as well. The Beatle fans were throwing jelly babies at them. The jelly babies are a soft, sugary sweet made of gelatin, and George had admitted to reporters, "I can't leave jelly babies alone. If there are any in sight, I just eat them." Once the story got into the magazines, the Beatles started to get pelted by them. Mal later remembered if he wasn't battling a fuselage of gelatin as he made his way around the stage with light bulbs flashing. He said if only one had foresight and invested money in flash bulbs and jelly babies, we could have made a fortune. The Beatle fans were getting more rambunctious. Mal invited his sister Barbara to the Beatles' performance at Liverpool's Empire Theatre, where she sat in the second row. That night the crowd was roaring. Barbara said the screaming was so loud the Beatles might just as well have been miming. By the time the tour made its way through the Birmingham, where the Beatles played the Hippodrome, on November 10th, Tony Bramwell noticed that the fans acted as if they were attacked by a virus that changed their moral standards. Teenage girls wanted sex with the Beatles, and they didn't care how they got it. When they tried to grab a live one, crawl through the windows, or hide in wardrobes, they were sorted out by Mal and Neil. The fans were like M&Ms to be sampled and tasted first. Brian, who was puritanical with his protégés were concerned, would have had a fit if he had known, but he was kept totally in the dark. So this is what Mal had been waiting for. After a lifetime of self-doubt over his body issues and shyness, he couldn't control himself. Tony wrote that Big Mal was a demon for sex. His stamina would have been remarkable in a harem. The girls willingly accepted that they would have to do it with Mal to get to John, Paul, George, or Ringo, and Mal knew it. And there was another thing that got Tony's goat. Brian and Neil and I had developed this policy that we wouldn't pose in photographs with the Beatles. Fans wanted to take pictures of the band. They didn't want us hanging around beside the boys. But Mal wanted to be as close as possible to the Beatles' vortex of fame. Tony said the flashing bulbs and the band's celebrity was too much for Mal to resist, and he was always in the effing photos. After the Beatles shows at Coventry Theatre, November 17th, Mal and his bandmates were going to have a day off that Monday before resuming the tour in Wolverhampton, a few miles south of Liverpool. Mal was excited to have the opportunity to spend the day with Lily and Gary, and he packed up the gear in the Ford van. The large post-show crowds hindered his efforts, and by the time he left the adoring souvenir-hunting fans, they had stolen the van's windscreen wipers and outside mirrors. When Mal reached the outskirts of the city, it started to rain heavily, and there were high winds. Mal had some shut-eye in a roadside rest stop, and then he decided he wanted to continue home. When he woke up, the rain had slowed down, but when he got back on the road, he had trouble driving in the gale-force winds. And when he tried to control the van, the Ford careened into a 30-foot-tall lamppost, which crushed the passenger side. The van had served the Beatles since 1962, and it was done. It was lying on its side on the roadway in a heap of twisted metal. The Beatles' gear suffered little damage, but Mal wrote that he was thrown clear, and he landed on his head. He came to at one point to find headlights of a huge lorry standing over him, the driver only just stopping in time. Mal was lucky to be alive, and he was in the hospital for almost a week at the Stafford General Infirmary in Cannock, and he had to have 20 stitches. Beatles fans found out where he was at the hospital and went there hoping to see a Beatle, but it didn't happen. Neil and the band had already traveled to the next series of gigs, so Mal had to recuperate in the hospital. Paul sent Mal a letter. He said, "You big clubbo. Leave the nurses alone and get plenty of rest. You'd be surprised, but it's good for you." Mal took Paul's advice and began relaxing at home with Lily and Gary as the Beatles continued their journey across the North. As time went by, Mal was eager to get back to the group. He ignored Lily's well-meaning objections and left home in a huff, slamming the door behind him in mid-argument, storming out on his wife in the bargain. He said, "I broke the pact which Lily and I had made, and that was always to leave home smiling." Mal resolved never to behave in such an unpleasant manner again, but he just couldn't wait to get back on the road. He and Lily would make up soon enough. Lily, though, didn't like how things were going, she said. He'd been such a considerate husband. Now it was worse than him having another woman. It was like him having 4 mistresses: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The Beatles had Christmas shows to do after finishing their autumn tour in mid-December. Mal had prepped the Beatles' equipment for opening night at Astoria. Everything had been set up and tested beforehand. Mal said the sketches and the rest of the acts were all finished, and it was time for the Beatles to end the show. All of a sudden, just a few bars into Roll Over Beethoven, the power on stage failed completely. Mal came out of the wings to fix everything as quickly as possible. Paul quipped, "I would like to introduce our road manager, Bill Haley." As Mal lumbered onto the stage, the roadie corrected the problem with a few quick adjustments. It was caused by the Beatles' regular equipment upgrades from Vox. The constant parade of gear from Vox had kept Mal adjusting shifting wattages, changing power supply configurations, and patching into house-specific public address systems, and sometimes the road-weary roadie would make mistakes. Mal said, "One time, I switched an amp on before connecting it to the speaker, and this was very naughty of me, for when I plugged it in, the speaker blew. It was just one more item I had to remember." Following the Christmas break, Mal had the pleasure of returning to Lily and Gary for a brief spell. In 1964, it got off to an unfortunate start when John's guitar went missing. A 1962 Gibson J160E Jumbo Acoustic Electric. The guitar had already had a storied past. John had played it on such early Beatle classics as "Love Me Do," "She Loves You," and "I Want to Hold Your Hand." Mal thought that Jumbo had disappeared after one of the Astoria theater shows that January. Mal got yelled at by John, especially after it had been suggested that the roadie had misplaced the guitar and didn't want to admit it to his employer. Mal felt the loss of the guitar was one of his lowest moments of his Beatles career. For years, John teased him about the missing Jumbo, saying, "Mal, you can have your job back as soon as you find my guitar." The loss of any Beatles gear shouldn't have been a surprise. The more famous the Beatles got, the more chaotic things got backstage. There were the usual fans hoping to mingle with the Beatles, and of course not to mention all manner of press and local bigwigs eager to meet the boys. Sometimes the Beatles area backstage had physically challenged visitors that were brought in by well-meaning friends and relations who had come to believe the bandmates possessed otherworldly powers. Mal knew that when it came to the disabled, The Beatles, and John in particular, had a bad track record. In his teen years, John contorted his face in the presence of the mentally and physically handicapped and disfigured war veterans, cruelly mimicking them, hunching his back and dragging a leg like Quasimodo. In post-war Hamburg, John put his crippling into the stage act, a practice he continued to the present day. Brian had managed to stop some of the band's unprofessional proclivities, like swearing and eating on stage, but John didn't want to give up on this odious behavior. But it came back to haunt the Beatles because it seemed like more crippled people came face to face with the Beatles because they had been deposited backstage for a quasi-religious laying on of hands. Ringo said people would bring in these terrible cases and leave them in our dressing room. They'd go off for tea or whatever, and they would leave them behind. It got very heavy. We would shout, "Mal, cripples," and that became the saying even when there were no handicapped people present. If there were any people around we didn't like, we'd shout, "Mal, cripples," and they'd be escorted out. Mal tried to solve problems whenever they arose. George said that he had a big bag that he developed over the years because it was always, "Mal, have you got an elastoplast? Mal, have you got a screwdriver? Mal, have you got a bottle of this? Have you got that?" And he always had everything. If he didn't have it, he'd get it very quickly. He was one of those people who loved what he was doing and didn't have any problem about service. So in this episode, Mal was hoping to find free love in Sweden. Instead, he found it back home with the Beatle fans who wanted to get close to the Beatles. They had to get to know Mal first, and he knew it. Next, he was told by Brian to stop looking so scruffy, and Mal didn't like it. He felt that Brian was jealous of him because he was so liked by everybody. Mal longed for the limelight, and he didn't mind getting into photos with the Beatles, even though Neil and Tony and Mal had made the pact to stay out of pictures because the fans only wanted to see the Beatles. Then Mal had to be in the hospital when bad weather caused him to crash and to destroy the Beatles' van. The Beatles moved up to a limo ride after their shows in order to get out before the fans could grab them. Mal had the duty of taking away people who were physically impaired if there were too many of them gathering backstage. Their caregivers, for some reason, would wander away for a cup of tea and leave them in the dressing rooms. Then we found out from George that Mal had a bag that he had built up through the years, and he was able to provide anyone with whatever they asked for. George said he loved his job, and Mal loved to be of service to people. Mal loved what he was doing, even if it meant leaving his wife and his son alone for large periods of time. He was still a free man through it all. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. So I hope everybody is having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.